The most dangerous words I heard on the day I buried my husband were not spoken by a stranger. They were whispered by the woman who called herself my daughter-in-law. My name is Margaret Holloway, and I was 69 years old the afternoon I stood beside the polished oak casket that held the man I had loved for 43 years. The sanctuary of the small church in Burlington, Vermont, was filled with white lilies, soft organ music, and familiar faces that carried expressions of sympathy I barely recognized through the haze of grief. I remember the scent of fresh flowers, the gentle creak of wooden pews, and the cold November rain tapping against the stained glass windows. What I remember most, however, was not the funeral itself. It was what happened after the final prayer. Family members gathered quietly in the reception hall beside the church. Coffee was poured into paper cups. Plates of sandwiches and cookies lined the buffet table. Conversations stayed soft, respectful, and brief, exactly as they should after saying goodbye to someone who had lived an honorable life. My husband, Richard, had always believed that kindness mattered most during moments when people were hurting. He had spent his entire career as an accountant helping neighbors who could not always afford professional advice. He believed numbers told the truth, but character revealed it. As I accepted another gentle embrace from one of Richard's longtime friends, I caught sight of my son Nathan speaking with several relatives across the room. His shoulders looked heavier than I had ever seen them. Losing a father changes a man, no matter how old he becomes. Standing beside him was his wife, Rachel. She wore an elegant black dress with a tailored coat, her blonde hair perfectly arranged despite the rain outside. From a distance she looked composed, almost comforting. If someone had never met her before, they might have mistaken her confidence for strength. I wanted to believe that today would bring our family closer together. Grief has a way of making people reach for one another, or at least I always believed it should. Richard certainly would have wanted that. We had talked many times over the years about how important it was for family to stay united after one of us was gone. As I stood quietly near the display of family photographs, looking at pictures from vacations, birthdays, anniversaries, and ordinary Sunday afternoons that suddenly felt priceless, Rachel walked toward me carrying a polite smile. She lightly touched my elbow as though she were guiding me away from the others for a private moment. I assumed she wanted to ask how I was holding up or perhaps tell me that Nathan was worried about me. Instead, she leaned close enough that only I could hear her voice. "Margaret," she whispered gently, "I just wanted you to know that Nathan and I have already decided how Richard's estate will be handled. You really do not need to worry about any of that now." For a moment I simply looked at her. Around us people continued talking quietly. Someone laughed softly while remembering one of Richard's old fishing stories. The coffee machine hummed in the corner. Life continued moving exactly as it always does after loss, unaware that a single sentence can divide one moment from the next forever. Rachel smiled again, almost as though she expected relief to appear on my face. Instead, I smiled back. It was not a smile of agreement. It was not even a smile of forgiveness. It was the quiet smile of a woman who suddenly understood that she had been underestimated. "Thank you for letting me know," I answered calmly. Nothing more. I did not argue. I did not ask questions. I did not remind her that Richard and I had spent decades planning every important decision together. I simply picked up my coffee cup and walked toward the large window overlooking the rain-soaked cemetery where fresh earth surrounded the grave we had left only minutes earlier. As I watched the rain fall across the hillside, memories began rushing through my mind. Richard had never been careless with important matters. Not once in 43 years. He planned birthdays 6 months early. He labeled every household file. He balanced every checkbook to the penny. If there was one thing I knew with complete certainty, it was this. My husband would never have allowed anyone to decide the future of our family without making absolutely certain I already knew every detail. That certainty settled quietly inside me, replacing confusion with unexpected peace. Behind me I could hear Rachel confidently speaking with distant relatives as though nothing unusual had happened. Nathan remained unaware of the conversation. My granddaughter Emma sat alone near the fireplace, looking down at one of the old family photo albums with tears in her eyes. I took one final sip of my now lukewarm coffee before reaching into my handbag. My fingers closed around my phone, and without hesitation I searched for one familiar name that Richard had told me never to forget, especially if life ever became unexpectedly quiet. I pressed the call button, listened to it ring once, and when Edward Carlyle answered, his very first words made me realize Richard had been preparing for this day far longer than anyone else in that room could possibly imagine. Edward did not sound surprised to hear my voice. In fact, before I could say more than a simple greeting, he spoke in the same calm tone I had known for over 30 years. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I have been expecting your call. Are you all right?" I looked through the rain-speckled window toward the cemetery where the last mourners were slowly making their way to their cars. "I am standing," I answered honestly. "That is about all I can promise today." There was a gentle pause before he replied. "Richard once asked me to tell you something if this day ever came. He said you would understand exactly when the time was right." Those words settled deep inside me. Richard never spoke dramatically. If he left instructions, there was always a reason. "Can you come to the reception?" I asked. "I already planned to," Edward answered. "Give me 20 minutes. Do not discuss anything about the estate until I arrive." The call ended, and for the first time that afternoon I felt something unexpected replacing the heaviness in my chest. It was not relief. It was certainty. Richard had anticipated far more than I ever realized. I slipped my phone back into my handbag and returned to the reception hall. Family friends approached one after another with warm embraces and quiet stories about Richard. One neighbor remembered how he spent an entire weekend repairing a broken porch without accepting a single dollar in return. Another recalled how Richard always arrived early to volunteer at the community library fundraiser every spring. Listening to those memories reminded me that a person's true legacy never fit inside a bank account. It lived inside the people whose lives they quietly improved. Nathan eventually walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to me without saying anything at first. His eyes were tired, and the grief on his face looked painfully familiar because I knew I wore the same expression. "How are you holding up?" he asked softly. I smiled with as much warmth as I could manage. "One breath at a time." He nodded. "Dad always said you were stronger than both of us." I looked at my son and saw the little boy who used to wait by the front window every evening for his father to come home from work. Some parts of parenthood never disappeared, no matter how old your children became. "Strength is easier when someone is standing beside you," I answered. He lowered his eyes without responding. Before either of us could continue, Rachel appeared beside him with the same composed smile she had worn all afternoon. She gently rested one hand on Nathan's arm before looking at me. "Several relatives have been asking about Richard's office," she said. "Nathan and I thought it might be best if we started organizing everything this weekend before it becomes overwhelming." Nathan looked surprised. "This weekend," he repeated. "I thought we were going to wait a little while." Rachel answered quickly. "It is easier to stay ahead of these things." I quietly watched the exchange without saying a word. Nathan did not appear to know about the conversation Rachel and I had shared only minutes earlier. That realization told me more than any explanation ever could. I simply nodded politely. There will be plenty of time for decisions later. Rachel smiled again, but this time I noticed something different. It was not confidence. It was expectation. She seemed certain events would unfold exactly as she had planned. She excused herself to greet another group of relatives, leaving Nathan standing beside me with a puzzled expression. "Did I miss something?" he asked. I placed my hand gently over his. "Not today," I answered. "Today is about your father." He accepted the answer, although I could see questions forming behind his eyes. Across the room my granddaughter Emma sat quietly turning the pages of an old family album. I walked over and sat beside her. She pointed to a photograph taken nearly 15 years earlier during a summer picnic by Lake Champlain. Richard stood behind all of us wearing his faded baseball cap while pretending to steal a hamburger from Nathan's plate. Emma smiled through fresh tears. Grandpa always made everyone laugh. I touched the edge of the photograph. He believed laughter made difficult days easier to survive. She leaned against my shoulder for a moment. Grandma, she whispered, I heard Mom talking about Grandpa's office before the funeral even started. My heart remained steady, but her words lingered in the quiet space between us. Did she say anything else? I asked gently. Emma hesitated before answering. She told Dad not to worry because everything would belong to us soon anyway. Before I could respond, the front entrance opened, letting in a cool gust of November air. Conversations throughout the reception hall gradually softened as a tall silver-haired man in a navy overcoat stepped inside carrying a well-worn leather briefcase. Edward Carlyle paused near the doorway and looked directly at me. His expression carried neither surprise nor uncertainty. It carried the quiet confidence of someone arriving exactly when he had promised, and as our eyes met across the crowded room, I realized he was not carrying condolences inside that briefcase. He was carrying the first piece of a truth that Richard had protected for years. Edward walked across the reception hall with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime delivering difficult news without raising his voice. Several people recognized him immediately and offered respectful handshakes. He returned each greeting politely before making his way directly toward me. When he reached my side, he did not open his briefcase or mention legal matters. Instead, he placed one gentle hand over mine. Richard would have been proud of you today, he said softly. You carried yourself exactly as he believed you would. I smiled faintly. I am not sure I had much choice. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. You always have a choice, Margaret. Richard admired that about you more than anything. Those words lingered in my thoughts because they sounded exactly like something my husband would have said. Edward had known Richard since law school. Their friendship had lasted longer than many marriages. If Richard trusted anyone besides me, it was Edward. We stepped away from the crowd and stood near the church library where old family photographs decorated a long table beneath soft lamps. Rain continued falling outside the tall windows, creating a quiet rhythm against the glass. Edward spoke carefully, making certain no one else could overhear. Richard left very specific instructions regarding today, he said. He hoped I would never need to follow them, but he insisted I be prepared. I remained silent. After 43 years together, I understood my husband well enough to know he never prepared for something without good reason. Edward continued. Before his health declined, he reviewed every estate document, every trust, every property record, and every beneficiary designation. He revised several items personally. I looked at him with genuine surprise. He never mentioned making changes. Edward smiled gently. Because he promised he would only tell you if those changes ever became necessary. I felt an unexpected warmth replacing the chill that had settled inside me all afternoon. Richard had not hidden things from me. He had protected me from unnecessary worry while he was still alive. That realization felt exactly like him. Before I could ask another question, Rachel appeared across the room speaking animatedly with two of Richard's cousins. She gestured toward the family home while smiling with unmistakable confidence. I watched several relatives nod as though plans were already being discussed. Edward quietly followed my gaze. Has something happened? He asked. I hesitated only briefly before repeating Rachel's exact words from earlier. She told me she and Nathan had already decided how Richard's estate would be handled. Edward's expression remained remarkably calm. He did not appear shocked. Instead, he slowly closed his eyes for just a second before reopening them. Then Richard judged the situation correctly, he said almost to himself. His response caught me completely off guard. What do you mean? I asked. Edward lowered his voice even further. About 2 years ago, Richard began noticing changes inside the family that concerned him. Nothing dramatic. Small things. Conversations that stopped when you entered the room. Decisions made without including you. Assumptions that did not match reality. I searched my memory. Suddenly small moments I had dismissed over the years returned with uncomfortable clarity. Rachel insisting on keeping duplicate keys to the house. Rachel volunteering to organize filing cabinets Richard had always managed himself. Rachel encouraging Nathan to postpone conversations with me because I supposedly needed less stress. At the time, every explanation sounded reasonable. Looking back, each one felt slightly different. I thought I was imagining those things, I admitted quietly. Edward shook his head. Richard noticed them too. A heavy silence settled between us. Across the room, Emma quietly hugged one of her great-aunts while Nathan thanked guests for attending the service. My son still looked unaware that two entirely different conversations were unfolding under the same roof. Edward reached into his briefcase but stopped before removing anything. "Not yet," he said, almost as though reminding himself. Richard gave me precise instructions about timing. I smiled despite everything. He even scheduled this conversation? Edward actually laughed softly. "Margaret, your husband organized his garage by alphabetical labels. Of course he scheduled this conversation." Hearing someone laugh because of Richard instead of simply mourning him felt strangely comforting. For a brief moment, grief stepped aside and allowed gratitude to breathe. Just then Nathan approached us carrying his empty coffee cup. "Edward," he said warmly, "thank you for coming." The two men embraced briefly. Nathan looked exhausted. "Dad always said you knew where every important document was." Edward answered carefully. "Your father believed preparation was an act of love." Nathan nodded without fully understanding the meaning behind those words. Rachel soon joined us, smiling politely as though nothing unusual had happened all afternoon. "Edward," she said smoothly, "perhaps sometime next week we could all sit down and discuss the estate." Edward looked directly at her with the same professional courtesy he offered everyone. "There will certainly be a meeting," he replied. However, Richard personally determined who would attend first and when that meeting would take place. Rachel's smile faded almost imperceptibly. I was under the impression everything was fairly straightforward. Edward gently closed his briefcase. Many people are under that impression. Before Rachel could respond, he turned toward me. "Margaret, tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, I would like you to come to my office alone. There is something Richard instructed me to place in your hands before anyone else sees it, and once you read the first page, you will understand why he insisted no one, not even your own family, could be present when you do." The next morning arrived wrapped in low gray clouds that seemed unwilling to let the sun appear. I drove through the quiet streets of Burlington with Richard's old leather gloves resting on the passenger seat beside me. He had forgotten them there years earlier after helping a neighbor shovel snow, and somehow I had never moved them. They reminded me that ordinary things often carried extraordinary memories. Edward's law office occupied the second floor of a red brick building overlooking the town square. Richard and I had climbed those same wooden stairs more times than I could count, usually to sign tax documents, update insurance papers, or discuss retirement plans we once imagined would stretch far into the future. Walking through the familiar front door without him felt strangely unreal. Edward greeted me personally before his assistant could even stand. "Good morning, Margaret," he said warmly. "I have coffee waiting in my office." Nothing about his voice sounded hurried. Nothing suggested surprise. It felt as though he had rehearsed this meeting in his mind many times, hoping it would never become necessary. His office looked exactly as Richard remembered it. Shelves filled with neatly organized legal books lined one wall. A framed photograph of Edward and Richard fishing together at Lake Champlain rested beside the window. Two comfortable leather chairs faced a large oak desk polished until it reflected the morning light. Edward waited until I sat before opening the familiar leather briefcase. He removed a thick cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. Across the front, written in Richard's unmistakable handwriting, were only 6 words. "For Margaret. Open only with Edward present." My fingertips rested gently against the envelope, but I did not break the seal immediately. Seeing Richard's handwriting again felt almost like hearing his voice across the breakfast table. Edward quietly poured coffee into 2 porcelain cups before speaking. "Richard prepared this almost 18 months ago." I looked up in surprise. That long? He nodded. He believed responsible planning was one final act of love. I smiled sadly because those words sounded exactly like my husband. He believed planning ahead spared the people you loved from carrying unnecessary burdens later. I carefully broke the wax seal and unfolded the first page. The paper trembled slightly in my hands, not because I was afraid of what it contained, but because I already missed the man who had written every line. My dearest Margaret, the letter began. If you are reading this, then Edward has honored the promise he made to me, and I know you have already experienced something that convinced you it was time. I paused for a moment, taking a slow breath before continuing. You may be wondering why I chose not to explain everything while I was still alive. The answer is simple. I wanted people to reveal themselves freely, without believing I was watching. I slowly lowered the page. He knew, I whispered. Edward answered gently. He suspected. There is a difference. I continued reading. During the last 2 years, I noticed subtle changes inside our family. No single event alarmed me. It was the pattern that concerned me. Assumptions about property. Conversations about inheritance while I was still alive. Decisions that quietly excluded you. I prayed those concerns would disappear. If they did, this letter would never matter. Tears blurred the ink for only a moment before I blinked them away. Richard had carried those worries without placing them on my shoulders. That realization hurt almost as much as losing him. Edward remained silent, allowing me to absorb every sentence at my own pace. Halfway through the letter, another folded document slipped from between the pages and landed softly on the desk. I unfolded it carefully. It was not another letter. It was a handwritten timeline in Richard's neat printing, listing dates beside short observations. Some entries simply read, Margaret was not consulted. Others said, estate discussed without necessity, or, Rachel assumes future authority. None of the notes sounded angry. They sounded factual, almost like an accountant recording figures inside a ledger. I looked at Edward with disbelief. He kept records? Edward nodded. Only after he realized isolated moments might someday need context. A heavy silence settled over the room. Richard had not been building a case against anyone. He had been documenting patterns so that if the day ever came when you questioned your own memory, you would not have to rely on feelings alone. I returned to the final page of the letter. If you have reached this point, then I ask only one thing. Do not allow grief to rush you into decisions. Read every document. Listen before speaking. Let people show you who they choose to become after I am gone. I carefully folded the pages together. My heart felt heavy, yet strangely peaceful. Richard had left me guidance instead of instructions, wisdom instead of control. Edward finally opened a second folder that had remained untouched on the corner of his desk. Margaret, he said quietly, everything you have read so far was personal. What comes next is legal. He slid a blue folder toward me. Across the front were the words Holloway Family Trust Restatement. Before opening it, I noticed one smaller envelope clipped beneath the cover with a handwritten note from Richard that simply read this before anyone else enters the room this afternoon. I looked up at Edward in confusion. This afternoon? He met my eyes calmly. Yes. Because at 2 o'clock, Nathan and Rachel will be sitting exactly where you are now, and they believe they already know what these documents contain. I looked at the smaller envelope for several quiet moments before carefully opening it. Inside was a single handwritten note from Richard, folded neatly in half. His handwriting was as familiar to me as my own. Margaret, before anyone else enters this office today, I need you to remember something. The purpose of these documents is not to punish anyone. They exist to protect you while grief makes every decision feel heavier than it should. If our family remains united, these papers may never need to change a single life. If they have forgotten what respect looks like, then let truth speak more loudly than emotion. I gently folded the note and slipped it back into the envelope. Edward waited patiently until I looked up again. Richard always knew how to calm me, I said quietly. Edward smiled. That is one reason he wrote instead of trying to explain everything while emotions were still fresh. He then opened the blue folder and carefully arranged several documents across the desk. Every page had colored tabs marking different sections. Richard's attention to detail seemed to appear everywhere I looked. Edward began speaking in the same calm, measured tone he had used throughout our meeting. Margaret, the first point is the easiest to understand. Nothing automatically transferred to Nathan or Rachel when Richard passed away. That assumption would be incorrect. I listened without interrupting. Under the Holloway Family Trust restatement, every major asset remains under your complete ownership and authority during your lifetime. He pointed to the first page. The family home. The lake cottage. Richard's accounting practice. The investment accounts. Every significant financial decision remains yours alone. I felt neither excitement nor satisfaction. Instead, I experienced something far simpler. Relief. Richard had not left me unprotected during the most vulnerable season of my life. Edward continued turning pages one at a time. Richard believed that inheritance should never become a source of entitlement. For that reason, no beneficiary receives direct authority until specific conditions have been met. I looked carefully at the language. Everything was written clearly, without complicated legal wording designed to confuse ordinary people. Richard had insisted on that years ago because he believed important documents should always be understandable. Edward then paused before opening another section marked with a gold tab. This next provision is the one Richard spent the most time discussing with me. He placed the document directly in front of me. At the top appeared the words Family Stewardship Provision. Rather than giving immediate control to future beneficiaries, Richard appointed you as the sole trustee with complete discretionary authority. I looked up. Meaning? Edward answered gently. Meaning no one inherits decision-making power simply because they expect it. Every future distribution depends upon your judgment. The room became very quiet. Outside the office window, late autumn leaves drifted across the town square while church bells marked the noon hour. Richard had never wanted money to become the center of our family. Instead, he had made trust the center of every decision. Edward folded his hands together. There is another section I believe explains why Richard structured everything this way. He opened the final divider inside the folder. Unlike the previous documents, this one contained a short statement written entirely by Richard himself. Edward read it aloud. If Margaret ever believes someone values property more than people, she is authorized to delay, reduce, redirect, or restructure future distributions as she believes appropriate. My confidence in her judgment is absolute. I closed my eyes for a brief moment. Richard had not left me wealth. He had left me responsibility. There was an enormous difference between the two. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Edward glanced toward the office clock. It was 5 minutes before 2. They are early, he said quietly. He stood and walked to the door without opening it. Through the frosted glass we could hear faint voices in the reception area. Nathan sounded tired. Rachel sounded composed, almost cheerful. Edward returned to his desk. Before they come in, there is one final matter you should know. He removed a sealed legal envelope from the bottom of the folder. This document has never been shown to anyone else. I looked at the seal bearing Richard's initials. What is it? Edward rested his hand lightly upon it. A confidential instruction that only becomes relevant if someone attempts to influence estate decisions before you are ready to make them. My mind immediately returned to Rachel's whispered words at the funeral reception. Edward did not need me to explain anything. He had already understood. Before either of us could speak again, another gentle knock sounded at the office door, followed by the receptionist's polite voice. Mr. Carlyle, Mr. and Mrs. Holloway have arrived for their 2 o'clock appointment. Edward looked at me with calm reassurance before carefully placing the sealed envelope beside my hand instead of opening it. Margaret, he said quietly, what happens during the next hour will tell us whether Richard's greatest concern was only a precaution or whether he understood your family better than any of us realized. Edward walked to the office door and opened it with the same calm professionalism he had shown all morning. Nathan entered first, his shoulders still heavy with grief, his dark suit slightly wrinkled after 2 exhausting days of funeral arrangements. Rachel followed closely behind him, elegant as always in a tailored black coat, carrying a leather notebook as though she expected an ordinary business meeting rather than the first legal discussion after her father-in-law's funeral. She smiled politely when she saw me. "Margaret," she said warmly, "I hope you have not been waiting long." I returned the smile. "Not at all." Edward invited everyone to sit before taking his place behind the oak desk. He waited until complete silence settled over the room before speaking. "First, allow me to express once again how deeply sorry I am for your loss. Richard was my closest friend for more than 40 years. Nathan nodded quietly. "Thank you, Edward. Dad always trusted you." Edward folded his hands together. "He did. That is precisely why he spent considerable time preparing today's meeting." Rachel leaned forward slightly. "We appreciate everything being organized so quickly. I know there are probably several documents we should begin reviewing." Edward acknowledged her comment with a courteous nod but did not reach for any papers. Instead, he looked directly at Nathan. "Before we discuss documents, I have one question. Nathan, what do you believe your father wanted most for this family after his passing?" Nathan looked surprised by the question. He thought for a long moment before answering. "He wanted Mom taken care of." Edward smiled gently. "That is correct." Rachel added quickly, "And I believe he also wanted the estate handled efficiently so there would not be unnecessary complications." Edward remained composed. "Efficiency certainly has value." Richard agreed with that. However, it was never his highest priority. The room grew noticeably quieter. Edward opened the blue trust folder and carefully placed the first document on the desk where everyone could see it. Richard's estate plan is unusually straightforward in one important respect. Rachel's confident expression returned. "That is good to hear." Edward continued without changing his tone. "Nothing transfers automatically to Nathan. Nothing transfers automatically to Rachel. Every significant asset remains under Margaret's complete ownership and authority." Rachel blinked once, clearly caught off guard. Nathan looked toward me in confusion before turning back to Edward. "I thought Dad and Mom owned everything together." "They did," Edward answered. "Following Richard's passing, Margaret became the sole owner under the trust structure Richard established." Nathan slowly nodded as the information settled in. Rachel remained silent for the first time since entering the office. Edward calmly continued reviewing the documents. The family home, the accounting practice, investment accounts, retirement assets, and the lake cottage all remain under Margaret's direct control. Nathan looked at me with genuine relief. "That actually makes sense. Dad always said Mom understood every financial decision they ever made together." Hearing those words warmed my heart. Richard would have been proud that our son remembered that truth. Rachel finally spoke again, although her voice sounded noticeably more careful than before. "So eventually everything will still pass to the family?" Edward answered with absolute clarity. "Eventually, future distributions will occur according to the trust, but timing, structure, and administration remain entirely within Margaret's authority." Rachel glanced toward me before asking another question. "Does that mean changes are still possible?" Edward did not hesitate. "Yes." That single word seemed to hang in the air far longer than any lengthy explanation could have. Nathan frowned slightly. "Changes?" Dad could still change things after. He stopped himself before finishing the sentence. Edward gently clarified. "Richard cannot. Margaret can, within the authority specifically granted to her under the trust." Nathan looked thoughtful rather than upset. Rachel looked as though she were rapidly reconsidering assumptions she had carried for months. Edward then reached for another document but paused before opening it. Richard anticipated that today's discussion might raise questions. For that reason, he left a personal letter intended to explain why he structured the trust this way. Rachel sat a little straighter. Nathan quietly folded his hands together. Edward unfolded the letter and began reading. My family, if you are hearing these words, remember that inheritance is never proof of love. Character is. The office fell completely silent. Edward continued. Everything Margaret oversees belongs under her care because no one understands our family better than she does. If you ever find yourselves questioning her decisions, first ask whether you have earned her confidence through your actions. Nathan lowered his eyes. Rachel remained perfectly still. Richard's words carried no anger, no accusations, only calm conviction. When Edward finished reading the page, he carefully folded it and returned it to the folder. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. Finally Nathan looked toward me. Mom, he said quietly, I never wanted you to feel alone in any of this. I reached across the table and gently placed my hand over his. I know, sweetheart. Rachel looked down at the notebook she had carried into the meeting but never opened. The confidence she had displayed at the funeral had quietly disappeared. Just then Edward reached beneath the blue folder and lifted the sealed envelope bearing Richard's initials that had remained unopened until now. He rested it carefully in the center of the desk before looking at all three of us. Everything we have discussed so far applies regardless of circumstances, he said. What is inside this envelope, however, only becomes relevant if Richard's concerns about outside influence prove to be justified, and before I open it, there is one question I must ask Margaret in front of every person in this room. I looked at Edward as the sealed envelope rested quietly in the middle of the desk. Richard's initials, carefully pressed into the wax months before his passing, seemed almost symbolic now. They represented the last promise my husband had placed in someone else's hands. Edward folded his own hands before speaking. Margaret, Richard instructed me that before I open this envelope, I must ask you one question in front of Nathan and Rachel. His voice remained calm and measured. Do you believe anyone has attempted to influence estate decisions before you were emotionally prepared to make them? The room became perfectly still. Nathan immediately looked toward me with concern rather than expectation. Rachel remained motionless, although I noticed her fingers tighten slightly around the leather notebook resting in her lap. I did not answer immediately. Richard had specifically written that grief should never rush important decisions, and I intended to honor every word he had left behind. Finally, I spoke quietly. Yesterday, after Richard's funeral service, Rachel privately told me that she and Nathan had already decided how Richard's estate would be handled. Nathan turned toward his wife so quickly that surprise appeared across his face before he could hide it. Rachel? He asked softly. She looked back at him, clearly realizing he had never known about that conversation. I was only trying to reassure Margaret that we would help with everything, she answered carefully. Nathan frowned. You never mentioned saying that. She lowered her eyes for a brief moment. I did not think it mattered. Edward listened without interruption before gently nodding. Thank you, Margaret. Richard anticipated that situations exactly like this might occur. He carefully broke the wax seal and removed a single legal document accompanied by another handwritten page from Richard. This document is not a punishment, Edward explained. It is a safeguard. He unfolded Richard's note first. If this envelope is opened, it means Margaret has confirmed that someone attempted to influence decisions surrounding my estate before she had sufficient time to grieve. Therefore, I ask everyone present to understand that my concern has never been about money. It has always been about protecting Margaret from pressure during the most vulnerable season of her life. Nathan slowly leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the letter. I could almost see memories passing through his mind. Rachel remained unusually quiet. Edward continued reading. Anyone who truly loves Margaret will first protect her peace before discussing property, business, or inheritance. If that principle has already been forgotten, then I ask everyone to pause before another word about my estate is spoken. The silence that followed carried more weight than any argument could have. Finally Nathan spoke, his voice filled with regret. Mom, I am so sorry. I honestly had no idea Rachel said those things yesterday. I looked at my son and believed him completely. Throughout the previous day he had seemed genuinely unaware of conversations taking place around him. He had Been mourning his father, not planning an inheritance. Rachel slowly lifted her eyes. Nathan is telling the truth, she admitted quietly. I never discussed it with him before speaking to Margaret. Nathan looked at her in disbelief. Why would you do that? She hesitated before answering. Because I convinced myself someone had to start organizing everything quickly. I thought I was being practical. Edward gently folded Richard's note. Practicality without sensitivity often feels very different to the person who is grieving. Rachel lowered her head. For the first time since I had known her, she stopped trying to explain herself. Instead, she simply listened. Edward then slid the legal document toward me. Richard also included an optional amendment. I looked down at the page. It granted me complete authority to postpone any future beneficiary distributions for up to 1 year if I believed additional time would strengthen family relationships before financial matters moved forward. I looked up at Edward. Do I have to decide today? He smiled gently. Absolutely not. Richard specifically prohibited any immediate decision. Nathan quietly exhaled, almost as though a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. Rachel looked at me with eyes that no longer carried confidence or expectation. Instead, I saw uncertainty and, perhaps for the first time, genuine reflection. I closed the amendment without signing it. I have no intention of making permanent decisions while I am still learning how to live without Richard. Edward nodded approvingly. That is exactly the answer I expected. Rachel slowly stood from her chair. Margaret, she said softly, I cannot change what I said yesterday, and I cannot pretend those words were appropriate. Looking back now, I realize I was thinking about responsibilities when I should have been thinking about your heartbreak. I am sorry. Her apology sounded different from the careful explanations she had offered before. It contained no excuses. Only honesty. I appreciated that, even though trust always required more than a single conversation. Nathan reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. Dad always told me you were the wisest person in our family. I finally understand what he meant. I smiled through quiet tears. Your father simply knew me better than anyone else. Edward carefully gathered the documents into neat folders before pausing one final time. There is only one item remaining. He reached beneath the trust binder and removed a small sealed envelope that none of us had seen before. Unlike every previous document, this one was addressed in Richard's handwriting to only one person. It read, to be opened by Margaret 30 days after my funeral, and not 1 day sooner. I took the small sealed envelope from Edward with both hands, studying Richard's familiar handwriting for a long moment before carefully placing it inside my handbag. 30 days had never seemed like a long period of time until that moment. Now it felt like an invitation to breathe before making decisions that could shape the future of our family for years to come. Edward stood and closed the blue trust folder with quiet satisfaction. Richard believed that grief deserves time, he said gently. He wanted every important decision to be made with a clear mind rather than a broken heart. Nathan slowly nodded. That sounds exactly like Dad. We left Edward's office together, but the silence between us no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt thoughtful. Outside, the November air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves, and a light breeze swept across the town square. Nathan walked beside me while Rachel remained a few steps behind, giving us space without being asked. After several minutes, Nathan finally spoke. Mom, I keep replaying yesterday in my head. He looked down at the sidewalk before continuing. I was so overwhelmed saying goodbye to Dad that I never noticed what was happening around you. I should have. I gently slipped my arm through his. Grief makes all of us miss things we normally would have seen. He shook his head. That is not an excuse. We reached my car, but neither of us opened the doors immediately. Instead, we stood quietly beneath a maple tree whose golden leaves drifted softly onto the pavement around us. Nathan looked at me with the same sincere expression he had worn as a little boy whenever he admitted making a mistake. Dad always protected you, he said. I think I assumed he always would. I smiled gently. Now we protect each other." His eyes filled with emotion, and for the first time since Richard passed away, I felt that my son was no longer simply grieving his father. He was beginning to understand the responsibility his father had quietly carried for decades. Rachel slowly walked toward us. She stopped several feet away instead of immediately joining the conversation. "Margaret," she said softly, "may I say something?" I nodded. She took a slow breath before speaking. "When Richard became ill, I convinced myself I needed to take charge of everything. I started organizing appointments, paperwork, schedules, and eventually I forgot that helping someone is very different from replacing them." She paused before looking directly into my eyes. "Somewhere along the way, I also stopped seeing you as Richard's partner and started seeing you as someone who needed decisions made for her. That was unfair, and I am deeply sorry." I appreciated that she did not blame stress, grief, or confusion. She accepted responsibility without asking for immediate forgiveness. "Thank you," I answered quietly. "That honesty matters." She nodded once but did not expect anything more. It was a small beginning, and sometimes that was enough. During the following weeks, I watched actions replace promises. Nathan visited every Saturday morning, not to discuss finances but simply to help around the house because he knew Richard had always handled the heavier chores. Together we cleaned gutters, stacked firewood, and repaired a loose porch railing that Richard had planned to fix before his health declined. We rarely talked about the estate. Instead, we talked about fishing trips, family vacations, and stories that made us laugh despite ourselves. Rachel changed in quieter ways. She stopped arriving with lists and schedules. Instead, she began asking questions. She would call and ask whether I wanted company before coming over. She brought homemade soup one rainy afternoon because she remembered Richard saying it was my favorite. She never mentioned money. Again. The greatest surprise came from Emma. One Sunday she appeared at my front door carrying an old scrapbook she had made in elementary school. Every page contained photographs of Richard teaching her to ride a bicycle, helping with science projects, or cheering at school concerts. "Grandma," she said, "I thought maybe we could finish it together." We spent the entire afternoon adding newer memories and writing stories beside each photograph so future generations would know the man behind the pictures. As I watched my granddaughter carefully preserve those memories, I realized Richard's greatest inheritance had never been financial. It lived inside the people who carried his kindness forward. Exactly 30 days after the funeral, I sat alone in my living room with a cup of tea as afternoon sunlight filled the house. Richard's final sealed envelope rested on the coffee table before me. I remembered Edward's instruction clearly. Not one day sooner. I carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. It contained only a single handwritten page. As my eyes reached the first sentence, I immediately understood why Richard had wanted me to wait until grief had softened into reflection. The very first line read, "If Nathan and Rachel have spent the past 30 days earning back your trust instead of asking for your inheritance, then the future of our family is brighter than even I dared to hope." I read the first sentence several times before continuing because it felt less like a letter and more like Richard sitting across from me one last time. "If Nathan and Rachel have spent the past 30 days earning back your trust instead of asking for your inheritance, then the future of our family is brighter than even I dared to hope. If they have not, remember that protecting your peace is never an act of selfishness." I smiled softly as I continued reading. "Margaret, throughout our marriage, people often complimented me for being organized. The truth is that none of my plans would have mattered without your judgment. Numbers can protect property, but only wisdom can protect a family. That is why I trusted you with every decision I could no longer make." I lowered the letter for a moment and looked around the quiet living room we had shared for so many years. The afternoon sunlight rested on Richard's favorite armchair, and for the first time since his funeral, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt grateful. I finished reading the final paragraph. "Do not measure people by their worst moment alone. Measure them by what they choose to become after they recognize that moment. If they choose humility, encourage it. If they choose gratitude, celebrate it. If they choose love over entitlement, then they have already honored my memory better than any inheritance ever could. I carefully folded the letter and placed it beside our wedding photograph on the mantel. Over the next several months, I quietly watched my family continue making small choices that required no audience. Nathan never asked another question about money. Instead, he asked whether I needed help replacing the old fence behind the house before winter arrived. Rachel never brought another notebook filled with plans. She brought fresh bread from the bakery on Saturday mornings and often stayed only long enough to share coffee and conversation before heading home. One afternoon she admitted something that stayed with me. "I spent so much time trying to prove I could manage everything," she said, "that I forgot relationships cannot be managed. They have to be cared for." I reached across the kitchen table and squeezed her hand. That realization is worth more than any apology. Emma continued visiting almost every weekend. Together we organized Richard's old photographs, labeled family recipes in his handwriting, and created memory boxes for future grandchildren who might never have the chance to know him personally. Watching 3 generations preserve one man's kindness reminded me that the strongest family traditions were never written inside legal documents. They were repeated quietly from one heart to another. 6 months after the funeral, I invited Edward to lunch at the small diner Richard had loved for years. We ordered the same tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches Richard always insisted tasted better there than anywhere else. As we finished lunch, Edward smiled and asked the question I knew would eventually come. "Have you reached a decision regarding the amendment?" I looked out the window where children were laughing in the nearby park. "Yes," I answered peacefully. "I have." Edward waited patiently. "I have decided not to activate it." He nodded without surprise. "May I ask why?" I smiled. "Because Richard gave me authority to protect the family, not to divide it. He trusted me to recognize the difference between a mistake and a pattern that refuses to change. Over these past months, I have seen enough quiet changes to know our family chose the harder path. They chose growth." Edward leaned back with a satisfied expression. I believe Richard would be very proud of that answer. Nearly a year later, on the anniversary of Richard's passing, our family gathered at the lake cottage where so many summer memories had begun. The trees reflected brilliant shades of gold and crimson across the calm water, just as they had every autumn during our marriage. Nathan prepared lunch on the old stone grill while Emma laughed as she taught her younger cousins one of Richard's favorite card games. Rachel walked over carrying 2 mugs of hot cider and handed one to me before sitting quietly beside me on the wooden dock. We watched the water for several minutes before she finally spoke. "Thank you for giving me the chance to become a better daughter-in-law instead of allowing me to remain the person I was becoming." I looked at her gentle smile and realized she no longer resembled the woman who had whispered about an estate during the darkest afternoon of my life. "Richard believed people could grow," I said softly. I decided to believe him. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, our family gathered for a simple meal around the old wooden table inside the cottage. Before anyone began eating, Nathan stood and raised his glass. "Dad spent his life teaching us how to build security," he said. "Mom taught us something even greater. She showed us that respect must always come before inheritance." No one spoke for several moments after that because there was nothing left to add. We simply reached for one another's hands around the table, and in that quiet circle I finally understood Richard's greatest legacy. It had never been the house, the business, the investments, or the trust. His greatest gift was leaving behind a family that had learned, sometimes the difficult way, that love lasts longest when it is protected by humility, gratitude, and respect.